Hi, welcome to my 15th anniversary studio stream. Not the 15th anniversary of the studio stream, but this week marks 15 years since I began creating content on costume production topics online, first as a blog and then through several different social media platforms, and now in the midst of pandemic launching this YouTube channel. So welcome. My name is Rachel. My channel is La Bricoleuse, which is also the name of my blog that has been going since 2006 and all the intervening incarnations. So thank you for joining me today. First, I'd like to have a toast to the 15th anniversary here at the beginning of the stream, and then I'll also have another one at the end as it closes. The idea being, well, partly because I like toasting things, but also because I know how streams go, and sometimes people are able to join at the beginning, but they need to leave before the end of the stream, and by the same token, people join the stream late and are only able to catch the last part. So in the interest of holding a toast with as many people as possible. Oh, welcome. Sandra Schitz has joined from Austria. It's great to have you. Thank you so much for coming. I'm just about to toast my 15th anniversary here at the outset of the stream, and we'll have another one at the end. But cheers to 15 years of costume creation content in both the blog and this YouTube channel. And if you haven't had a chance to watch the retrospective video that came out on Monday and explains the progression of La Bricoleuse from the initial conception of it as a blog in 2006 on the LiveJournal platform to now, and so I suggest that if you are interested in the details of that, you can watch that video. It explains it all. If you're just joining me, say hi in the chat if you are so inclined. And I also, before I jump into answering the questions that I have from my viewership, that's what I'm doing in today's stream, I do want to briefly revisit the drawn bonnet that I began working on. Well, I began working on it before last week's stream, and in ordinary times I would just continue to work on it in this stream. Because it's my anniversary, it's sort of on pause. I'll get back to it next week. But I wanted to show you progress in case you're a longtime stream viewer, because this was a flat piece of fabric with some channels sewn into it that I was threading cording through the last time you saw it. And at this stage, I'll show you a front view too. I've drawn up those cords, and this is just the brim section of the bonnet. If you look at the back, I don't have the tip piece on here yet. That's to come, maybe by next week's stream. And this is the only support that's happening in this drawn bonnet brim so far, is the cording and the gathering of the taffeta, which in this case is quite crisp. And you'll see that it has a pretty substantial amount of structure right now, even though I can squish it up flat in my hands and smoosh it down and, do all kinds of stuff with it. It does have the taffeta and the cords impart a good deal of structural integrity to it already, right? I think, and I suspected this from the beginning, but pinning it out on this head has confirmed that I think what I would like to do to reinforce the structure of the bonnet brim is to run a wire or a piece of heavier cording in one of the outer channels along the edge to just give it some more oomph, so that this arc of the front around the face would stay nice and controlled in a smooth shape. So that's to come. But before I jump into these questions, I just wanted to sort of revisit that bonnet. Oh, thank you. Sandra says in the chat, the bonnet already looks amazing and so sturdy. I'm amazed. I'm really impressed with the structural stability of this taffeta. I've only made 2 other drawn bonnets, and those were both with silk du peony, which has got a sort of a slubby texture to it, and both of those worked fine. The cords, the channels did not have cords through them. In that case, what I used was millinery wire, and I did have a student build a calash bonnet, which is a very similar structure, with trimmer line, which is a plastic cord. I was skeptical of this taffeta plus just cotton cording. It's basically yarn, like crochet yarn, but it really is quite sturdy. I'm so impressed with how much structure just comes from the gathers and the channels and the taffeta itself. And this taffeta, I bought it honestly because it was on sale. It was like $4 a yard, and this is a personal project. I don't have a costume designer providing me with the fabric in this case, and I knew I wanted this type of taffeta. I didn't care what color it was. So this baby blue, it's fine. I like it, and it goes well with, it's one of the colors of the university where I work. Hey, Aiva has shown up. Thank you. Happy anniversary, she says in the chat. I have a glass here if you would like to toast with me. I've already done my toast at the beginning of the stream. I'll do another one at the end. But welcome. Thank you so much for showing up. And I was just going over this drawn bonnet that I began in the last stream before I start answering viewers' questions. Oh, and Arlene is here. Is that 2 layers of taffeta, or are the channels done with a fold of a single layer? I have not already answered that. You didn't miss it. Unless I mentioned it last week in the stream. But this, I ordered a yard of taffeta, and the piece, I didn't really mean this to be like all about my bonnet, but it's good. I have plenty to say about this bonnet. The piece is like, if you split and spread a rectangle into a slight arc, it's 2 pieces of that bagged out. So I sewed it into a tube and bagged it out through the ends, and then folded the ends back into themselves so that I have a finished edge where you have sewn channels and you can stick your bodkin, or in this case yarn needle, up in there. So yes, it is 2 layers of taffeta with the channels in the part of the sandwich, sort of reinforcing that sandwich of the taffeta. So I can, if I want to stick my finger up in between the channels right now, I can do that. Thinking through the process on this, I had thought, well, I'll leave that open, and then if I need to like run a piece of bias tape for a strut that goes across and stabilizes it, of wire or cane or whatever, I could do that. And otherwise I might whip stitch that close after the fact. Ava says you're right about the taffeta being nice and crisp. And what you said last week about the shot and cross woven colors is 100%. I said the reason that I chose the cross weave of the taffeta, in this case, the fibers are blue on the warp and white or silver on, well, not metallic, but, silverish on the weft, or vice versa. Can't remember. But it's changeable in the light. Hi, Denise. Thank you so much. She says happy anniversary in the chat. And I mentioned that I wanted it to be taffeta, and I chose this cross weave because often costume designers love that cross woven taffetas and du peonies and other types of fabric. That cross weave creates depth in the stage lights, which stage lights usually wash out a flat color on a bonnet or another costume piece, and they love those cross woven fabric choices because it automatically imparts a depth that otherwise would need to get painted into it by someone like me, a painter dyer, or a crafts artisan who does a lot of different positions. Someone like Denise, who's joining us here in the YouTube stream. I meant to stream on IGTV, and I totally spaced bringing my tablet up here to do it. And then I started the stream and was like, oh crap, that tablet's still downstairs. So hopefully people, I did post to IG from my phone, and hopefully those people will join us. With this bonnet, I think some of you who are just joining us now missed the full view. I don't have a back on it yet. I have just pinned out my structure to test the stability of this brim, and I've concluded that what I would like. She says, are you using cording instead of cane? Denise asks in the chat. And what I'm using is a crochet yarn that was recommended in a blog post by an artisan named Twyla T. That she may still write this blog, but she was an instrumental costume blogger from the historical reproduction background, I believe. I could be wrong, but I've referenced her blog post a couple of times in having to make these types of bonnets. And as Denise asks in the chat, are you using cording instead of cane? When I've made this type of bonnet in the past, I've put millinery wire in the channels. But Twyla's blog post mentions this particular brand of cotton crochet cord. And it's a little bit, it's less of a twist than like piping cord. But it's similar. You could use it to create piping or cording along the edge of a costume item. So since this doesn't need to succeed, since there's no one whose show is going to open and they will be hatless, I thought I would try the material that she recommended and see what I thought of it. And that's why part of why I've pinned it out on this dolly head here, was to see if it imparted enough stability to the brim that I didn't think it needed any other more stable piece down these channels. And I do think that in the absolute outer channel, and I don't know that I need it in any other channel, but I might put something stable. No, definitely it'll be in the outer one. I want to do either millinery wire, cane, or trimmer line, probably millinery wire, just to control that edge a little more, because the gathers and the cord, the cotton cord, I feel like they actually are sufficient because of the crispness of this taffeta to maintain the kind of stable shape that I want, but also because I personally can just like crunch this up. I just would like to have some more control over it and some more stability imparted, because I may donate this to the theater, but I'm buying all the materials myself and I'm just doing it as a sample for fun. I might also donate it to the Jane Austen Summer Festival that is happening. Actually, I believe the first day was yesterday here in Chapel Hill, sponsored by a group here on the campus of UNC-Chapel Hill. And I donated my previous Regency bonnet, this strip straw one, to them. And they were so appreciative. And I loved the idea of one of these bonnets that's too deep of a brim to be stage worthy becoming something that a reenactor or a historical interpreter would wear at one of these costumed events. So I may call them up and see if they want this one too, because I think it's going to turn out really great. But I do think so far, if you can see the flimsiness of this cord that is in the channels right now, it's great on your hands for pulling up for drawing up the brim. And I think it will be stable enough for majority of the structure because of how crisp that taffeta is. But I don't think it's crisp enough to maintain the shape that I want in the wind, because historical interpreters are often working outside or inside outside circumstances, like maybe they're in a historic home and they go outside, put on their bonnet, and walk around the grounds. I envision the future of this being worn in the outdoors, and I want some more control on that outer edge of the brim. If you have a beverage and would like to toast with me, I think I'm just going to do toasts the whole way through the stream, because it's a celebration, and this is non-alcoholic, so I can drink as much of it as I want and not be a mess. But what I'd really planned to do in the stream today, several of you asked questions of me over the past week in the various platforms on which I post as La Bricoleuse, the blog, the Facebook, the Instagram, the Discord channel, the costume Discord server, and nobody asked any questions in the chat for this stream prior to the stream. But if you come up with questions like you have been asking in this bonnet discussion, just pop them in there and I'll get to it. Denise, before we leave the bonnet though, Denise says, always good to try. I've done the same, but on a hidden buckram frame. My next is to try it with cane or nylon rod. I haven't done it on a hidden buckram frame, but the research book that I showed in my stream last time, that was mostly this woman's analysis of mid-19th century bonnet styles, drawn bonnet styles from the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, were almost all built on a hidden buckram frame or a hidden esparterie frame, a hidden wool. They call it willow in these, Godey's Lady's Book references that she has in there, and I think that's interesting, because then it becomes a kind of a fancy trim. Essentially, you're using the fashion fabric as a decor element with a buckram frame. And I think that construction is really interesting. Denise, I'll be interested to see how yours turns out. You also say, my next try is with cane or nylon rod. And my next try is with trimmer line, because I had a graduate student who made a calash with fairly thick trimmer line, which is the name under which weed whacker line is sewn. Like there's a plastic thing that swings around and around and cuts your weeds. And I really liked her results, because instead of a round cross section, it's square. So it only bends in two directions. It only bends in the up, down, and side to side axis. So it worked really well for these bands that you don't need them to wing around in there and become all scroodly. It imparted a stability just by the nature of the cross section of the material. And it's plastic, so you could throw the whole thing in the washing machine if you want to, and it'll come out okay. So that was an interesting development that one of my grad students came up with. Arlene says, why not? Why limit to one toast? Cheers? Yes, cheers. Aiva says, yay for festive. No alcohol toast. It's just midday for me. That's right. You're on the West Coast. Well, thank you for joining me at your lunch break, I guess, kind of. Denise says, I like the rod because I can drill it. That's true. You can put a hole in a nylon rod and then stitch through and through to secure it in the bonnet. I like that idea too. Scroodly is a technical term. And Aiva has also used trimmer line, springy and moisture resistant. You know, what I used it for first was I had to make a parasol that the canopy could, like you imagine the parasol, that you could peel up one part of it and flip it over, and now there's a new canopy, like a sort of reversible canopy flap that went back and forth. And the ribs of the flap on the changing canopy were trimmer line. because it made it want to grip the dome of the canopy when the parasol was up. And then when I flipped it over, it wanted to grip it in the other direction. That's like a once in a lifetime problem that you have to solve, or actually as a crafts artisan, maybe a twice in a lifetime problem. But it's a problem I've solved. And so I share that with you. If you ever are in a circumstance where some director is like, can we just have them peel the canopy back and suddenly it's purple? You can say, yes, I actually know exactly how to do that. I think I published about it in some USITT thing, and I definitely wrote about it on the blog back in the beginning. Which that is a great segue to start my questions from people over the past week. And the first question, I have them here on my phone. The first question is from Trisha, who is a Las Vegas costumer. Well, she lives here in North Carolina now, but for many years, she had a shop in Las Vegas and created costumes for all of the big spectaculars there, like Blue Man Group, several of the Cirque du Soleil shows, other non-Cirque du Soleil circus shows, and anyway, huge, think showgirls and acrobats and people swinging from the ceiling. And Trisha, who lives here in Winston-Salem, actually, she's moved her shop out here. She has, in the pandemic pause, right prior to it, she had launched an online pattern drafting school, I guess, called Creative Costume Academy. And just by coincidence, she had begun putting that in place when the whole performing arts industry shut down. And she was like, well, I guess I'm going to just throw myself into that. And it's a huge success because plenty of people have been getting more and more into sewing and so forth. And of course, we all made masks for, as fast as we could for as long as we needed to. But many of the home sewing community wanted to boost their skills. And so she's had great success in that pattern drafting school that she's launched. And I actually have an interview with her about her lengthy career as a costumer for Vegas spectaculars, but also about her new school coming out Monday. And she asked me, that's a big preamble to the question she asked me, which is, did you think it would look like this today when you started La Bricoleuse 15 years ago? What is different? Which is a great question, because so much is different, and not just because the COVID pandemic shut down the performing arts industry for so long. And we're only now looking at little glimmers of it starting to come back. But of course, I didn't see that coming. But when I started La Bricoleuse originally as a blog in 2006 on the LiveJournal platform, I mean, at that time, LiveJournal was such everybody had a LiveJournal, or maybe they had another blogging platform journal like Diaryland, or I remember there was one called Dead Journal, which was like the sort of like goth companion to LiveJournal. But everybody had a blog, and they were all interlinked. Like, if you are old enough to remember the land of the blogs, like if you remember a web ring where your blog would link to another blog and that blog would link to another blog, and you'd create little communities and stuff. And I thought, well, I'll start a blog because there's no gatekeeper there. Nobody has to decide that what I'm writing about is worth publishing. Like, if nobody reads it, who cares? It's the internet. Or if a bunch of people want to read it, then they can search on these terms and find it. I didn't see the development of so many different social media platforms coming. I think we had Friendster and MySpace, which were kind of like precursors to Facebook. And Facebook even already existed, but it was only for university students. And I guess what I didn't see coming was the rise of video content and creators of video content among literally anybody with a phone. That in 2006, if you wanted to film a movie, you couldn't do that on a smartphone because you didn't have a smartphone. Like, I think Blackberries were the only smart handheld device that you could even interface with rudimentary internet. So, the proliferation of social media and platforms and modes of delivery that came with the advent of the iPhone and Android and stuff, I wouldn't have seen that coming, although because I'm not in the tech field, it wouldn't have occurred to me to think forward of like, what's the next step past laptops. I'm glad though that the pandemic was sort of the impetus, the fire under my butt to start the YouTube channel, because I really was to the point where I was like, I should just give up on La Bricoleuse because it's not needed anymore. People don't read blogs, and there are so many people creating content about stuff like making their furry costume or their cosplay of their favorite superhero, or you don't have a lack of information about how to make literally any costume you can think of. I mean, except maybe the chameleon parasol, which I can write that up and I can write a script for that and make a video, and then suddenly that will be something that actually I need to add that to my list of potential videos, because that's a great idea, and the way that it's video lends itself well to that, because let's see, chameleon parasol. Video lends itself really well to that because describing it in a blog, there's only so much you can envision in your mind. And I think they might have filmed a trailer for that show, but I don't have access to it, like trying to find PR from a show 10 years ago. Good luck with that. But that is Trisha's question. I'll cross it off. The next question comes from an Instagram follower who goes by the IG ID Sewing for Your Life, all one word. And they ask, how and when did you choose a career in millinery/theater, or when was the point that you thought, this is it, this is my path? I think the word that's doing a lot of work there is choose. Because the point at which you choose a career in theater, so much of it is, there's an aspect of luck, there's an aspect of networking or being in the right place at the right time, and there's an aspect of like, are you a person that other people feel they collaborate well with? Like, if you have an abrasive personality or a rigid sensibility, then chances are, no matter how much you want a theatrical career, like you need to grease that wheel a little and be a little more fluid in your dealings with others, or people are just not going to hire you because you're a pain in the ass to work with. But when I chose to specialize in crafts, I was barely aware that crafts was a focus. Like in my undergrad program, it was sort of presented as like, often these are things that the costume designer has to deal with because from their perspective, it was a case of like, you're probably going to work at a theater that doesn't have the money to pay anybody else to do these very specialized things like millinery and shoes and wings and masks and so forth. So you as the designer are going to need to do that. And I was like, well, that's what I like to do. So I guess I'm going to be a designer, since that's what seems like from my professor's advice how you get to do that. And then I moved to Boston, and my first freelance job that I got was as an overhire stitcher at the Boston Ballet. And that was the first place I worked that had a dedicated crafts person whose entire job was to make all the headdresses and dye the tutu net or the spandex nylon or whatever, and make all the weird things like the rat heads for the nutcracker or whatever. And when I saw what she was doing, the crafts artist in there, which, bless her heart, I can't remember her name. I think it was, Jill Thibodeau, maybe. But when I saw what she was doing, I was like, that's what I want to do. So I told, like, I was freelancing. At the time, there were, 20 theaters in Boston, and you could get as much overhire work as you could take. And I was often getting hired as a stitcher or a first hand, but I always told the people hiring me, I want to do crafts, so if you have a crafts person who needs help, I want to help them. So either hire me as their assistant, or maybe I can get sent over there if my draper has nothing left for me to do. And that was, I guess, I was Denise's assistant for a while. Denise, who's here in the chat, who's the crafts artisan at the Huntington Theater in Boston. I started there as a stitcher, and then the first hand on my team quit, and I got promoted to first hand. And then I got sent in to help Denise. And also, I think there was a Boston University graduate student who was crafts artisan on some shows for BU theaters that I was overhired to help her as well. Yes, Jill Thibault, Denise is saying in the chat. I got her name wrong. Her last name is not Thibodeau, it's Thibault. And, I'm thrilled with myself that I dredged that name up from the depths, because I only worked at the Boston Ballet for like 2 shows. But her work made a big impact on me in that it, seeing what her responsibilities were meant, changed my perspective on what I wanted to do with myself. The third question, that's the end of the answer to that. And the third question here is from an anonymous person: what famous shows have you worked on? Which I have to say, assuming that you mean like Broadway here, because when I was in Los Angeles, I worked on several television shows that I can't really even talk about even now. But assuming you mean Broadway, you don't really get hired on a show. You get hired at a shop, and then you're working on whatever that shop has contracts for at the time. And the shows don't go 100% to one shop. They'll split them up. So, like, the principals will be at Tricorn and Winterlings, and the men's ensemble is at Corelli. And I don't know if Corelli's closed now, but anyway, you get the idea. And when I was working at Parsons Mears this most recent time, which was granted like 4 or 5 years ago, what they had in the shop was Aladdin and Frozen, Lion King, and they were working on the Broadway show costumes for the women's ensemble of Hamilton, which had already run in a pre-Broadway version at the Public Theater as a preview, sort of checking it out, see if it's successful, developing it. And it hadn't opened on Broadway yet. And Parsons was building the women's ensemble, and when I got hired, I just got put on a team that I think I was one of 3 first hands and 5 stitchers that were building women's ensemble. It sounds really, I'm certainly very proud to have worked on Hamilton. And, but it is the big name one that people are like, wow, you worked on Hamilton. And I'm like, it was like 12 vests and 12 stretch trousers and 12 corsets and 12 jacket. Like it was not, it was not glamorous, but, I'm proud of the work that I did on it. I'm more excited about, I think we were building like, Lion King's been running for 20 years. So I built like the 50th version of, Scar's bodysuit, and that was more exciting to me only because the costume design in general is more craft heavy in Lion King. Denise says, I'm remembering your fanciful hair extension clips. Yeah, I pioneered all of those like unusual colored hair that clips in. Back in the 90s, I had so much synthetic hair piled on my head when I was Denise's assistant. that was my venture into changeable hair and unusual colors, and now it's in shampoo form. Progress, I guess. Another question here. This is actually a question I'm adapting from Arlene, who I believe is maybe still watching on YouTube. Iva says, quote me on this, if you think the job is glamorous, you are not doing it right. Oh boy, that's true. But Arlene asked a question on Friday, I think, and when I was a guest in Denise Fun Friday Millinery Studio stream, and because I know Arlene in person, like we both work at UNC-Chapel Hill. In non-pandemic times, we ride the same commuter bus to work. Like I know her sensibility, and so when she typed this question into the chat, which I could not see because I am blind, and Denise just read it back to me. We didn't really parse, I think, what Arlene was asking, and so I have reframed the question because I think what you were asking was basically what's the weirdest thing I've ever made, because I think the question was like, have you ever made something that you looked at it after the fact and were like, I made that? But regardless of whether that's exactly how you meant it, I'll just answer that question now because it's fun. The weirdest thing I've ever made, I would say that at this point it's a tie, and it's a good juxtaposition of, the one weirdest, super weird thing that I've made is, when you work in the theater, there is a canon of plays, or there's a body of work going back to, the ancient Greeks, to where you certainly want to develop new work, but theaters will put on well-known scripts that have a following and a scholarship behind them and all of that kind of stuff. And when I worked at ART as the head of crafts there, we did a production of Lysistrata, which is an ancient Greek drama about how the women in, I believe it's Athens, fighting against Sparta, and the women decide that they're going to go on a sex strike and refuse to have sex with the men unless they make peace with the Spartans. And the big, like, as a crafts person, if your theater programs Lysistrata into the season, that you're going to be building a bunch of erectile penises. And because it's written in the script, like, everybody has these phallus appliances that go up and down on cue, and it's always a thing to worry about aesthetically from the designer's perspective. Is it's a comedy, it's supposed to be funny, but like, we are such uptight people in contemporary America that, like, what are the phallus rigs, how do they work, and how are they funny, and just offensive enough. And so the phalluses that I made for that ART production were actually brass wire cages mounted on cod pieces with blow up balloons, like children's party balloons, that were blown up and strapped into there. And then at the very end of the show, all of the women popped the balloons and confetti came out. And so that is the first weirdest thing that I've worked on, exploding confetti phalluses. And then the second was a development of new work. So when a play is produced for the very first time, the playwright has come up with challenges that are mentioned in the script of costume elements that you, as the costumer, whether it's a draping question or a crafts question, the costume will need to do something, and it will be up to you to figure it out for the very first time. Because, like with the phalluses, that show's been done a million times, and you can look at countless numbers of ways that the penis effect has been created. But on this show, this was a development of a new show, also at American Repertory Theater, because they did a whole lot of weird theater while I was there. This show had a character who was a sort of an oracle character. Like, it took place in a hunting cabin in the middle of the woods, and this woman was actually like a actual human character. I mean, she wasn't magical, but they wanted her to function as an oracular character in the plot. And she's pregnant or recently had a baby, perhaps, one or the other, in the script. But the script required her to, she put her arms up in the air and recited these lines, and they wanted her to lactate on cue. And so we talked about, like, how can we do this? And we decided that crafts, i.e. me, needed to build some kind of lactating bra that could be remote controlled so that some technician off stage could push the button and the liquid would release to soak through her shirt. And there was a whole bunch of, like, what is the liquid that shows through, what is the shirt that the liquid can show most visibly on, what is the liquid, how do we, rig it up to this thing, and what is the control that squirts it out, and, remote control lactating bra for new work development is the second weirdest thing I've ever made. I have two more questions, and I think I'm going to run out of time. Well, or actually I could just hang out and answer them. I don't have anywhere to be this week. What's your favorite non-costume job you've ever had? And I can say that, but there's no contest. My absolute favorite non-costume job that I've ever had was when I lived in Boston. The theater I worked for was such that if I went away and did a summer stock job, I would lose my benefits. So I needed to stay in the Boston area, and I needed to work a job that was not official. Like, I needed to work under the table. Arlene says, and clean from the blouse in time for the next show. Yes. So I believe we had 2 blouses for that show. But it was not a fine fabric. Like, it was something that could go in the washing machine. It didn't need to be dry cleaned. But I had to find an under the table job, that like I could report my earnings in. I didn't have an official contract for another theater, basically, is what I'm saying. And so the guy that I was a crafts assistant to at the time worked in the summers at a leather production shop, making this custom leather shop catered to the kink crowd and primarily like the New England leather daddy scene. And they made a lot of, in addition to like, black leather harnesses and cuffs and collars and black leather pants custom fit to the client, black leather vests custom fit to the client. We also made black leather studded pageant sashes for people who were winning Mr. Boston Leather, Mr. Leather New England, Mr. Rhode Island Leather, Mr. Massachusetts Leather. Like, we made all those pageant supplies, I guess. And then also custom versions of all, whatever somebody wanted. Like, I made a pattern for a leather corset. I was actually hired in the first place to make a line of patterns for women's wear that were corsets and schoolgirl skirts that would be made out of leather. And then I think my favorite thing, the most fun thing that I made, was a black leather baby bonnet for an adult man that had a scalloped edge to the brim, very similar in shape to this, except imagine this out of black leather. That, bar none, was my favorite non-costume job. And I guess you could argue that it's related and costumey because of the different roles that people play in some of the kink society or scenes and stuff. But what I loved so much about it was the opportunity to learn about leather as a construction medium for these customized garments that had very specific purposes that the clients wanted them for. And it was like using all of the same analytical muscles of the brain to figure out how to create these things. That, like, I guess if I were, like, I don't know, super religious and uptight about people's sexual proclivities, I wouldn't have enjoyed it so much. But, I just loved having the opportunity to figure out all of these really unusual requests and also to learn so much about a very challenging material to work with, about construction and the quality of the finished goods that were allowed to be released to the client. They had a very high standard of construction quality, and the slightest mistake would get something kicked out and be like, okay, that's a practice, you're gonna have to redo that, because you can't really, like, rip out your seam and resew it in leather. Like, once you've perforated it, so that is my favorite non-costume job. And then this is the final question, by an Instagram follower. You are a published author. How did that come about? Which, that is an excellent question. I guess in respect to being a published author on the front of costume production topics, which I think that's the most relevant, I have always had an interest in writing both fiction and nonfiction. And I think initially, when I worked at ART, American Repertory Theater, that is the professional theater in residence on the campus of Harvard. The same way that the theater I work at now, PlayMakers Repertory, is in residence on the campus at UNC-Chapel Hill. And one of the benefits, literal benefits of that job working at ART, was I could take up to 2 Harvard classes a year with my supervisor's approval, and I would only have to pay the enrollment fees, which was $40. So, that was a huge benefit. I felt like that I could take any class at Harvard for $40. And they had an adult education certification program at the time in creative writing, where you could take, I think it was 6 classes in creative writing and get like a professional certificate that augmented your undergraduate degree. And I was starting to work toward that. And one of the classes I took was essay writing and creative nonfiction. and I wrote a piece about an instructional piece, actually, for an assignment in that class that I then submitted to what used to be a publication through USITT called Costume Research Journal. It's a juried publication, kind of like, all the stuff I write in my blog, all the stuff I make videos about, but because it's academia, it's juried, it takes forever. You submit it and you find out like a year and a half later that you need to rewrite it or whatever. But that was the first thing that I wrote as an assignment for that class and then published. And then in the intervening time, I've sort of been in a position where sometimes, like, I went to the costume symposium for USITT in, I think, 2008, and someone on the costume commission asked if I would write a conference report for the USITT journal Sightlines. It's a journal for just membership in that society, so I wrote that. The profile that I wrote of Denise, who's with us in the chat, I wrote a profile chapter, an interview with Denise and a profile of her career as a costume crafts artisan for an anthology called Theater Artisans and Their Crafts. And in that case, the editor who was putting it together was a man named Raphael Haen, who I had worked as a draper when he was the head of the theater program, costume design program at Emerson College in Boston, and have stayed in touch with him over the years, just professionally as colleagues. And he reached out to me and was like, didn't you work as Denise's assistant? You should write the profile on Denise because you're also a writer, right? And I was like, yeah, okay. So I wrote that chapter. And actually, even now, I right before I started this stream, I've just gotten the proofs of the book that I'm a co-author on that's coming out. And in that case as well, like, I didn't start as an author on the project. My two co-authors, Triffin, who's head of the program in which I teach, and Gregory, her husband, they had the book contract long before they even ever lived in North Carolina or she and I worked together. But they got to the point where they needed to turn in a draft, and she had just taken over as the costume director at UNC and was sort of overwhelmed by being in charge of that program and working on PlayMakers shows and trying to get this draft together. And she was like, I don't know how I'm going to get it all done. And I said, well, is there anything you could delegate to me? Because I can chunk out a chapter. I did it last summer. And she was like, actually, yes. So she gave me some folders of research, and I wrote some chapters for this book. Because really, like, the writing was the very last part of the book. The 10 years of research and then some that they did before that are where all the real work goes in, as assembling that body of research and getting those interviews and recording the words of the people who came before us all in the costume production industry. So I just got proofs of that. Like I said, I'm maybe 3 chapters in, and I'm so excited about this book coming out because, I mean, I wrote a chapter and a half, as it turns out, and there's 12 chapters in the book, I believe. And there are just so much history that is out there and laid out and covered that I've heard whispers of, like names that I've heard. I'm like, oh, well, that was back when Brooks Van Horn was on 52nd Street, or, in the New York costume industry, there's a lot of oral history and lore that when you work there, you just sort of osmotically suck it up because it's being talked about around you and referred to in these very casual, oh, everybody knows that, and if you don't, well, I'm just going to talk about it as if you do anyway. And this book has collected it all together and documented it and even refuted some things of like, well, a lot of people have said that this is true, but the historical record sort of records it slightly differently if you look at the press. And, it's great. And I feel somewhat bad saying that because I am one of the co-writers, but all of the stuff I'm reading right now, at least, is all new to me. You know, it's proof, so we're down to the point where you're just correcting misspellings and punctuation, but it's good. I cannot wait for this book to come out because I think there are loads of people that will read it and be like, oh, this colors in all the gaps. This connects all the dots. Like this, I mean, not all the dots. There's plenty of stories that aren't in that book. There's plenty of history that's not in that book, but it does illuminate a certain segment of the costume production industry development that I know parts of and now I know more of, and I'm excited to bring that to a wider readership. And the ultimate answer to that question of how did that come about is I'm a decent writer, but much in the way that I've gotten a lot of my jobs in the theater, I'm just in the right place at the right time with the right skill set. You know, like, I'm incredibly fortunate to have just been like, who is the person we can call who can write this up? Well, Rachel did that, and she's a decent writer. She can write a synopsis for your journal, sure. You know, which is not a great advice, not a great answer of advice for anybody who wants to be a published author, I guess, other than to say, you know, lots of people are in a position to need something recorded, to need something written up. And much like telling original costume shop managers, like, I'll come stitch for you, but what I really want to focus on is crafts. So if I can get those jobs, you know, at all, or you can shift me into them, I really would love it, and I have a talent for it. Writing it has been the same way for me, of like, well, we need someone to write this chapter. We need someone to write these chapters. We need a conference report. We need an event report, a book review. I'm the one that people think of, and that has worked so far. And the more that I deliver written things that are, you know, complete sentences and interesting to read, the more that people think of me as somebody who can come write this thing about whatever. And that is not remotely attached to fiction writing, which is a whole nother ball of wax. But that's the end of my stream. I want to have a farewell toast. This is, thank you all for joining me. I've really enjoyed the conversation in the chat. And, Arlene mentioned tear away perforated leather garments. You'd be surprised at how hard it is to tear away even perforated leather. And there is no salacious reason that I know that. It is more of a professional experience of like, you better sew it a few times before you can actually rip it away. Or an actor can wear it and then it will rip away, of course, because you don't want it to. But if you have anything to drink, I know Aiva's on the east or on the west coast, and you may not want to have a glass for lunch. But cheers! Thank you so much for joining me for my anniversary studio stream. And next week, I'm hoping that I'll have the tip on this drawn bonnet and can show you how I've reconciled that. I will definitely have figured out how I'm going to close all these channels and stabilize the bottom edge. I hope to have cut out the bavalet, which is the ruffle that goes around the back of the bonnet here that covers the nape of the neck. I really kind of want to be done with this bonnet, or at least mostly done, in next week's studio stream. Yeah, that's the plan, because I need to move on and do other things. I went and got some great hat blocks. I borrowed hat blocks. Denise says, raising her glass, and cheers. to 15 years of recording costume production topics. And thank God, I have to say, I'm so grateful that it has become a thing that people love. I mean, now, like when I first started La Bricoleuse, like there was nothing out there that you would Google something and my blog name, because if anybody had written about it, I had. And now, there's so many resources for cosplayers and furries and historical reenactors, and so many other people are recording how they're doing stuff, and I love it. Like, I don't want to be the only one doing it. I love being able to look stuff up and see how somebody made an Iron Man costume for Dragon Con or whatever. Like that, I'm not making an Iron Man costume for Dragon Con, but if I have to make 5 suits of armor, I really want to read about how you made your Iron Man costume, because I'm not going to make 5 suits of steel armor for the stage. Like, I want to know about your EVA foam or your Wonderflex or your Warbler or whatever. Cheers. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you are interested in this drawn bonnet, check back in with me next Thursday, because there will be much more progress on this thing, including a reed or trimmer line or a wire or something in this brim edge, and a tip, and hopefully a bavalet on the back of this thing. So that will be exciting to see. Thank